Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of DarshanTalks. I'm your host, Darshan Kulkarni. It's my mission to help patients trust the products they depend on. And as part of that, we talk to patients to find out what makes them trust a product and what makes them go, not quite for me. As you may know, I'm an attorney, I'm a pharmacist, and I advise companies with FDA-regulated products. So if you think about drugs, wonder about devices, consider cannabis, or obsess over pharmacy, this is a podcast for you. I do have to say, as a lawyer, it's not legal advice. I, in fact, do these podcasts because they're a lot of fun, and I find myself learning something new each time. So it'd be great to know if someone's actually listening. So if you like what you hear, please like, leave a comment, please subscribe. If someone likes these podcasts, please feel to share it out with them. If you want to find me, please reach out to me on Twitter at DarshanTalks, or just go to our website at DarshanTalks.com. Our podcast today is going to be really exciting because we're going to talk with a group that is a patient advocacy group, and we're going to learn from what's happening in the day-to-day. So if you are in clinical research and you're trying to figure out how do you engage with people in a way that's meaningful, in a way that is appropriate, whether you're a medical science liaison, a clinical trial coordinator, if you're a sponsor, or if you are another patient advocacy group, you probably will care about today's discussion. Our guest for today is the executive director for the Heart Valve Voice US. And I have been told to clarify, it is not in the US, it is just US. So our guest for today is John Lewis. Hey, John, how are you?
Thank you, Darshan. I'm very good. Thank you.
It's good to have you on. Before we start, let's start with the beginning, which is, what is the Heart Valve Voice US and why the US?
Sure. The original Heart Valve Voice was founded in the UK, and I worked very closely with my colleague there. And there have since been branches, if you will, in the US. We're about 5 years old. There's a relatively new branch in Canada, Mexico, Japan, Australia, and some other countries. And we work when we can and when it makes sense collectively. So Heart Valve Voice was founded because there really was not a patient advocacy group or a way to connect heart valve patients, to connect with heart valve patients and provide support for heart valve patients. Some of the manufacturers in the space try to do it, but that's always tricky. So as an independent nonprofit organization, it's really our mission to provide support for those patients, raise awareness about the disease, increase activity in the policy area to make sure policy is supporting patients in that area, to provide training in patient advocacy, to expand research opportunities for heart valve patients. And heart valve disease is just not a very well-known disease, unfortunately. And it's I like to say, part of my job is we have a very narrow focus. That's the good part about my job, and the bad part about my job sometimes, because it's a bit restrictive. But that narrow focus really helps us. And the fact is, heart valve disease affects about 1 in 8 people 75 years or older. So it tends to be a disease of older people, and they often dismiss the symptoms as just a sign of aging, that slowing down, or I'm not moving as well, or I'm not as sharp, and that's really not it. And it's often heart valve disease, which just weakens people, and they have dizzy spells or tiredness or what have you. But it's one of those diseases that, because it happens later in life, and because there's not a lot of awareness about it, even in the clinical community, even sometimes amongst cardiologists, the patients really have to advocate for themselves to have this diagnosed. And because they're often, not exclusively, but often older, they may have a lot of other conditions they're dealing with. They may have AFib or high blood pressure, or any number of other, we call them coexisting conditions. We don't like the term comorbidities. So these other coexisting conditions. So they really have to advocate for themselves to get the treatment, to get the diagnosis and the treatment they need. And that was ultimately why Heart Valve Voice was founded. And we've since spread our wings a bit in the policy area, and in education and training of patients, and in community building.
it raises so many questions and so many things I want to get into. So I hope you won't mind if we dig into each piece a little bit and see where it takes us. Let's start with the beginning, which is how do you get your funding?
We get our funding from different sources. We get some foundation funding, we get some direct corporate funding, and we get some, I'll call it quasi-government funding. For instance, the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, we're wrapping up a 2-year grant from them in the next month or so, which was actually designed to train patients, in our case, heart valve patients, in research advocacy, to train them how they can participate in, if it's an FDA review panel or a focus group for a clinical trial or an advisory panel, to make sure a clinical trial is designed with patient centricity in mind and with outcomes that are meaningful to patients, or an institutional review board. So we've been going through these training sessions now. When this was conceived, we thought these training sessions would be live. We had to move to a virtual model last spring for obvious reasons, and I think that's actually worked out very well, because it was always part of this vision that this training would be online after the live event, and we just never had the live event. But now the training is all online, and we've been getting really good, robust feedback, and we supplement it with live interactive sessions like this. We do one with a panel of faculty members. We do one specifically on telling your story, training patients to tell their story most effectively, and understanding the audience you're speaking to. Do you have 2 minutes with a congressional staffer, or do you have 15 minutes at an FDA advisory panel meeting or something like that? So in those different scenarios, and getting them to really hone down their story so it's most effective and most impactful. So we get funding from those different sources. One of the challenges as a small nonprofit is always fundraising. It's been a particular challenge in the last year and a half, with, on one hand, you just not being able to get out and press the flesh and meet with potential funders and explain what we do as a relatively new and not that well-known organization, and with a limited focus. On the other hand, there's been a real recognition that during this pandemic, there's a great need for patient education, and many other, and we've all seen commercials or public service announcements or what have you from other disease organizations and in other disease areas, to encourage patients to not just don't give up on your care. Don't just pack it in, because especially in the earlier days of the pandemic, when there were real restrictions on visiting the hospital, we saw heart valve procedures labeled as elective, and we pushed back on that, because if you're 75 years old and you've got a leaky heart valve, I don't know what's elective about that. We thought that was pretty critical. So we've been able to raise some funding for a campaign we launched in February called Just Go, that actually built off, when we were talking about some of the our global relationships, that built off something that an organization called Global Heart Hub, which is an umbrella organization of similar advocacy groups from around the world, throughout Europe and Japan and Latin America and US and Canada. So the Just Go campaign was started last summer to encourage patients to get treated if they were having symptoms of a heart attack, for instance, or a stroke. And we know many patients didn't. There was just this fear of going to an emergency room, and obviously the risk of not getting a heart attack treated was greater than the risk of contracting COVID potentially. So that campaign started last summer. As we went into this year, we realized that there was a segment of heart valve patients who may have been diagnosed immediately prior or around the start of the pandemic, or may have had their procedures scheduled, whether it would be a transcatheter procedure or a surgery procedure, may have had that procedure scheduled for let's say last June, or sometime last spring or summer, and those were bumped because they were deemed elective, because hospitals were closed up, there was limited capacity, and now there was this backlog of patients who had not gone for follow-up appointments or had not gone for their treatments. And how did we reach out to them to re-engage them? So in February, we began this our version, specific version of the Just Go campaign, targeted at those people who have been diagnosed but not yet treated. And it's a very difficult patient population to reach. We were very successful through social media and through some innovative online, more really market research or um, political polling type tactics to uh, reach these patients, and it's been very successful. And we went out with a public service announcement a couple of weeks ago as kind of the second phase of that campaign, and that will be wrapping up hopefully this summer. I mean, it's one of those things like the campaign was designed to run as long as it needed to run, and we were hoping it wouldn't need to run that long, because we wanted to get the patients back in with their physicians, or get them treated. And we're probably not quite through that whole funnel yet. So, but we think we've gotten the message out there, and we know we've had good engagement, and we know we've gotten a lot of people who have been treated in the last year who, we'll never know if they were treated because of the campaign, but we know we had a lot of people involved in the campaign who have gotten their treatment or gotten their follow-up appointments with their doctors.
One of the things we try to do on this podcast or this live stream is to give a little bit of pearls that I think there have been a ton of pearls in general, but one of the pearls I'm personally really interested in is, how do you tell your story, right? You made a mention to that early on, and you said it depends on, do you have 30 seconds or do you have 15 minutes? But I imagine there's some common threads, and I don't know if you've actually listened to your own the actual lectures there. I'm making an assumption that you have, but I'm just curious if you know. How should someone begin to tell their story?
It's a little difficult with, and I'm a communicator by training and by nature. So this is very close to me, and with patients, because you don't want to cut them off, and they're so passionate about their story and about their circumstances and about the obstacles they overcame to get treatment or to get diagnosed, when sometimes it was difficult. And what we try to do is provide them, and we bring in a professional in this. She works at our PR agency. She teaches communications at one of the colleges in Washington, and to give them a framework to tell their story in a cohesive, direct fashion. We can often have, and with apologies to patients out there, patients can often wander and go off in different directions and really elongate their story, because it's all important to them. And what we try to do in this training is to focus them into more of a step story. This is who I am. This is why I thought something was wrong with me. This was how I got treated, and this is how I'm living now. And I'm really shortening that, but a beginning, a middle, and an end, essentially, as any story should have. And to have them understand, the other part of that is to have them understand whether they're speaking to a potentially a physician audience, or an audience of medical professionals, or are they speaking to a 25-year-old congressional staffer who's not going to have any idea what aortic stenosis is. But hey, I had a heart problem, and something was wrong, and I wasn't breathing right, and I went to my doctor, and they couldn't figure it out, and eventually I got diagnosed, and then I got this great new treatment, and I'd really like Medicare to pay for it. So can you tell a story like that? And that's the essence of that type of training.
That's really cool, because what I heard you say without quite saying exactly these words. You mentioned the beginning, middle, and end, which I thought was really good. It comes down to focus. It comes down to planning. It comes down to cutting out the pieces that are incredibly important to you, but may not necessarily translate well into the story. So,
Right.
so I think that that's amazing. Like one of the things I take pride in is the fact that I can have a conversation with most people and have a really good time doing it. But that same skill set is the problem I have when someone tells me, now cut it down and make it 5 seconds. Like,
Right. right. Which is why I go back to my communications training. It's like 3 points. What are the 3 points I want to make in and out?
Right.
But sometimes I obviously, and we've been talking for a while, sometimes I can ramble as well. But yeah.
So the other question I have, one of the things you mentioned is the audience is 1 in 8 people over the age of 75 may end up suffering from heart valve disease, if you will. So my question to you is, it's a very specific audience. How do you have the oxygen to speak when there are people with cancers and people with with sort of heart disease or breast cancer? You know, there's behemoths in the patient advocacy world. How do you get the oxygen to speak?
That's a real challenge, and it's and what we've found, and what's been really what I've been learning from over the last almost 2 years now that I've been in this job, is we don't have the type of passion. Obviously, we have some very passionate patient advocates within the heart valve community, but it's not what you would see in cancer. It's not what you would see in the rare disease community, and part of that is, part of that may be age, part of that may be because, and this is something I've talked to a lot of people about really just in the past week, but ongoing, a patient psychology of, well, I had a bad heart valve and now I've got a new heart valve, so I'm okay. And that's really not the case. They need an ongoing treatment plan. So it's much different than other disease areas. If you look at cancer, diabetes, or other areas where the patients know it's chronic because they have to manage it every day. And with a heart valve disease, that once they've been treated, that may not necessarily be the case, or at least that's not their perception. And they may be dealing with other issues as well. So they put the heart valve aside and say that's been fixed. And it's interesting because I've gotten into these discussions too with some clinicians, and on one hand, clinicians see this need, rightfully, for this ongoing care of the patient with this disease, with heart valve disease. But I've had the conversation with clinicians too of, hey, just because this has gotten easier to do, this is not, don't treat it like an oil change. This is not, you're in, you got a new valve and you're out, and see you later. It's not, and that's the kind of the patient engagement piece that's sometimes missing. So it's so we struggle there in the bigger space. I mean, there's other heart organizations out there, obviously, and we work with many of them. We work with Mended Hearts and Women Heart, and with the American Heart Association, which is the big dog in the area, and they've got many times our resources. But that doesn't mean that there aren't areas where we can help them, and we do, and we share resources with them. They share resources with us. One of the things we're trying to do now is, as we revamp our website, is to bring in resources from many different organizations that are specific to heart valve disease, so it's one place where a patient can go.
So what I'm hearing you saying is you can't necessarily fight for oxygen. What you can do is you can work with others who also have a similar problem and create a coordinated front, which enables the issue getting the importance that it should. Is that fair? Okay.
Yes. Yes.
One of the questions I've wondered, and this is to a man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail, but from a legal compliance standpoint, one of the issues that has been popping up is how should patient advocacy groups work with industries like pharma? There are obviously ways to do it right. there are ways that can get you into trouble. And that's not just the patient advocacy group, but the pharma company itself. How have you seen it done right? What are some of the guardrails you follow to do it right?
Yeah, it's a good question, and and I look at it, and I may be a little more, and even prior to coming into this position, a little more open-minded or broader view of this is what is the ultimate benefit being delivered to patients, and is that um, the true focus of the relationship? And if it is, then maybe it's not as important where the money comes from. And there has to be clear ethical lines about what the pharma company or the medical device company who's ever funding a particular campaign or outreach effort or what have you can influence and can't influence. There are lines drawn, and when we work with companies in this area, it's very clear what they can influence and what they can't, and what information we will share back and what we won't. And I think that's important to establish. So I think you have to look at the ultimate benefit being delivered to the patient versus where the money's coming from. And if there seems to be some taint or stepping over the line, that can be exposed. But it's the same way I view any type of conflict of interest or perceived conflict of interest. Like I worked in Washington for a long time. I was a lobbyist. So there's this perception that, well, gee, we shouldn't allow lobbyists who may really know the subject matter that they work in, whether it's healthcare or energy or pick a subject. We shouldn't allow lobbyists to work in an administration. Well, then you're just cutting yourself off from this huge pool of talent, because you're presuming that that this person or this group of people are corrupt, and I just don't buy into that. So I think you've got to weigh this, and there are clearly examples of companies or individuals going over those lines often, and we've seen it in pharma, we've seen it in other places. But let's look at the big picture, and let's look at how it's benefiting patients.
Very interesting, and again, there are some rules and stuff we can talk about that offline. But I think you're right in that in the end you want to look at what is the goal you're trying to achieve, and is this the goal that all the parties share as you walk in, or is there something else? Because one of the things that the FDA and DOJ start thinking about, as I'm sure you know, is do they have board seats, and what is the impact of those board seats, and is the funding contingent? Are there competitors who are all on your board, or is it just one group and their voice matters more? Each of which would be interesting to delve into. But I think the question that came out from what you just told me is how does a lobbyist end up doing what you're doing?
I'll get to that. I want to address your board issue too, because there's an example there. So we do not have funders on our board by design. However, we do have physicians on our board who do research that is funded by medical device companies. So this gets back to my point about, do we want that expertise, which we desperately need, or are we going to say, well, gee, Dr. Smith gets money from XYZ company, so he's tainted, so we don't want his advice. Well, then who are we going to get advice from? And again, it's that presumption, I guess the presumption, you're an attorney, the presumption of innocence rather than the presumption of guilt. And so we get around that. So how did a lobbyist, and I lobbied, and I was a registered lobbyist. I wasn't a lobbyist. But my career, I look at my career and it makes sense to me. It may not make sense to a lot of other people. And I mentioned earlier that I'm a communicator by nature. So I started out in journalism, moved into PR, then did marketing and investor relations, and then started doing more government affairs type work, and then evolved into patient advocacy. So I see all of this as communications. I think I've done one thing in my career and just applied my core skill in different areas. And over the last several years, I really developed a passion for patient advocacy and patient engagement, and seeing how this was evolving in the pharma area among regulators, and the medical device area is way behind, and we can talk more about that in terms of patient engagement. But it was something I was very interested in pursuing at a deeper level professionally. And I was also looking for the opportunity to run an organization. I'd been senior in senior positions at other organizations, but really wanted to be in the CEO role, if you will, somewhere, and plot the strategy and implement the strategy, and direct the organization. And I deal with our financials and our whole scope of work. So that's what brought me to this job.
I guess my question that came out of what you just said, and I know we're technically well beyond time, but I'm going to ask you one last question because I'm just curious. Several years ago, as you know, the Sunshine Act came out, and the Sunshine Act basically tells you what physicians are being paid how much by different drug companies and device companies. For some physicians, that was a purification process where they basically said, look, see, I get no money from pharma, I get no money from device companies, I'm quote unquote pure, you can trust me. Other individuals came out and said, look, I get so much money from pharma, so much money from medical device companies. They know that I know what I'm talking about, so I must be trusted. And then there are patient advocacy groups who are looking at these same sets of physicians. What is, and I don't mean this as Heart Valve Voice US's opinion. This is a John Lewis seeing and talking to other people in the patient advocacy world. How is the Sunshine Act viewed?
The Sunshine Act, and understanding its intent versus how it's actually interpreted. And when I was lobbying, we called it the Bagel Act, because it got down to such a level of reporting that if a pharma company bought a doctor a bagel, they had to report the $2.50 or whatever. And it was really so I think, and one of the things we did, and it was getting research payments for research separated out of that database from other payments. And that was something I worked on from a lobbying standpoint with my prior organization, because we thought that was very essential, not to mix research in with other consulting or travel or what have you. So I guess the question is, if you're a patient, if this information is meant to be used by patients, and I'm not sure many patients use it, I'd like to see data on that. If this information is used by patients, to your point, do I want to go to a physician who was involved, who specializes in my disease, and who was involved in the development of a new drug for my disease, and is very knowledgeable about that? Or do I want to go to a physician who's not? And that's way oversimplifying, but let the patient make that decision. And if I see, oh, this doctor's gotten all of this money from all of these companies, and he's been on trips to Hawaii, and and like, okay, let's get a grip on this. Or is it, is this part of their professional development and knowledge gaining? And again, back to our opening part of the conversation, there are things that are appropriate and I think actually should be encouraged in terms of interaction between industry and clinicians, and there are things that are clearly inappropriate. And it may have been better to say, here's what's inappropriate, and let's call that illegal. But we chose to shine sunshine on these activities in a way that I'm not sure many people really understand, other than some of the organizations that were really lobbying for this kind of thing.
So let me rephrase the question. The Sunshine Act, I think, based on the GAO report, costs. I think they said it was $1 billion to implement, between the various costs, the initial jump off and then the continuing costs. From a patient advocacy viewpoint, where the cost of the valves is important, was this $1 billion well spent?
I don't think in the big scheme of things, I don't think the $1 billion is a significant number. Right? If you look at the industry's resources, the issues I had and we had more with this was the type of reporting, the detail of reporting, which put into place a compliance mechanism that didn't exist previously. So a pharma company or medical device company, they knew what they were paying to who, how they categorized that. And when you're getting into tracking individual meals, and when you're getting into situations where a doctor goes to a medical conference, a legitimate medical conference, continuing medical education, and the luncheon is sponsored by a pharma company and it's a buffet, and they say, I can't eat the buffet. That's where we get ridiculous. Okay, so was it money well spent? I don't think the money was the issue. I think it's the overall sense of compliance and knowing the rules. And actually, I would say in the last few years, I have not heard that many complaints. Certainly, some of the concerns have not come to fruition, but some of them have. I mean, I think it's had a real effect on some CME programs. It's limited those, and again, I just don't know how useful this information is, or if it's used in the proper context. You're mute.
Next time you come on, we need to talk about conflicts of interest, because I think that'd be an interesting conversation to sort of break down a little bit more as well. But this was amazing. John, thank you so much for coming on. I do have a couple of questions for you that go on. First question, based on what we discussed, what is something you'd like to ask the audience?
I guess something I'd like to ask the audience, especially to the extent there are industry folks out there, or even clinicians out there, is when you are considering your patient engagement, ask yourself how sincere that is. Because if it's not sincere, don't do it. So that would be my question for the audience, to ask themselves a question.
So the question is, when you ask for patient engagement, do you actually want it?
Yes. Do you actually want it? Are you going to treat it respectfully and honestly? And frankly, part of that conversation too is being straight with the patients and saying, we do want your input. It doesn't mean we're going to do everything you say. There may be medical reasons, clinical reasons, lots of compliance reasons why we're not going to, why we can't just cede control to patients, because we are professionals, running this clinical trial or running this program. But if it's just tokenism, then just don't pretend.
I love it. So 2 private personal questions. What was something that made you happy in the last week?
In the last week, last Friday, my wife and I went out to dinner in a restaurant for the first time since March 13th, 2020. So that I wasn't overjoyous, but it was certainly nice. It was certainly a nice experience if we're looking at the past week. Yes.
I 100% agree. I think that was, I just did the same thing with my girlfriend. So no, 100%. What is one thing you learned in the last month?
I learned, and it's really it's an ongoing education for me around, and it's a much bigger conversation in the country in learning. I mean, I'm a privileged white guy. I've had resources and education and opportunities, and I appreciate that, and I acknowledge that. But learning from patient conversations when we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and I made the point. I made the point in a call yesterday that it's like, we've gone from diversity to diversity, equity, inclusion, but now we just have to use shorthand DEI, right? Which I find offensive. Like if we're really serious about it, back to my comment about if you're going to do patient engagement, be sincere about it. If we're going to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, then let's not just shorthand it to DEI, right? Mm-hmm. So, but in hearing a story, and I won't get into the specifics or who this was, but in hearing stories of, and this happened to be a Black woman patient, about what they experience in the healthcare system and the presumptions that are made, or can be made, and the stereotypes that are just that they have to combat every day, and I don't. And I said, sometimes too, it's just bad service, and you can see it in other areas. I mean, not just in healthcare. Sometimes it's just bad service. But even if it's just bad service, if you're coming from a perspective where you have been discriminated against or disrespected through your life, then you're not even going to accept, well, everybody else is getting bad service too, right? You're going to take it more personally. And that was eye-opening to me as I guess we evolve in this this educational journey to DEI.
Fair enough. Let me do one thing. Let me summarize our conversation first of all. So during our conversation, we really talked a little bit about what the role is of Heart Valve Voice US, how you guys connect with the different heart valve voices across the world. Wow, that should be a tongue twister right there. But you talked about the impact you have. You're talking about policy. You're talking about connecting patients. You're talking about training, research opportunities, disease awareness, talking about comorbid conditions, research advocacy, and you were talking about telling your story. I love that you gave us a little bit of feedback on what telling your story could feel like. And you talked about being focused. You talked about the who am I, where here's where I thought I was, here's what I thought was wrong with me, here's how I was treated, and here's how I'm living now. That sort of short snippet of my story is a beautiful way to capture where we were going. You talked about the awareness, and you talked about the fact that 1 out of 8 people over the age of 75 suffer from heart valve issues. You talked about the idea of patient education. You talked about the Just Go campaign as well, which I thought was really interesting. You talked about your own past as a lobbyist and how that's played into the efforts you've made and the communication skills you've learned throughout that has translated into the work you do now. The other part of it is you talked about the Sunshine Act. We had a real great discussion about both sides of it. What are the implications of it? Has it been worth it, etc. And we talked about whether it was worth it. Did I miss anything?
That's a lot. No, I think we got it.
Awesome, John. If people want to reach you, where can they find you?
They can reach me. My email is John, John, at us.org, or they can go to our website. I'm on Twitter at jlewisdc. I'm on LinkedIn. If anyone's interested. So would be happy to connect with anyone who has questions or any patients who are interested in getting more information or getting involved in the organization.
Wonderful. And if you want to reach me, you can find me at DarshanTalks on Twitter, or find me at our website, DarshanTalks.com. If you like this podcast, you like this interview, please share, please spread John's voice. Tell people the kind of great work he's doing. Feel free to subscribe. There'll be more. We'll be bringing John back, hopefully, again. And this was just wonderful. So, John, thank you so much for coming on for the first time, and hopefully soon. Hope to see you back soon.
Thank you very much. I'd love to.